For centuries, societies believed they were collapsing because of enemies outside their borders. But history tells a far more dangerous story. Vincent. Behind every powerful society was an invisible system designed to maintain stability.
By the time ordinary people notice the collapse, the foundations of the civilization have usually been weakening for decades.
And this is where the story becomes dangerous, because the societies that destroyed themselves were often the same societies that believed they would last forever.
Every civilization begins by believing its systems are permanent, that the engines powering prosperity will continue forever. But beneath the surface of every powerful society, invisible weaknesses are already beginning to form. What looked like unstoppable growth was often a system pushing itself far beyond what it could naturally sustain.
And this is how decline often begins, not through chaos at first, but through comfort powerful enough to hide the warning signs.
Because the true strength of a civilization is not measured by its wealth, but by how much instability its people are willing to ignore. The most dangerous stage of collapse is when a civilization still looks successful from the outside. History never collapses all at once. It collapses through patterns humanity repeatedly refuses to recognize. And when the systems people depend on begin to fail, societies discover how fragile normal life truly was.
Because civilizations rarely collapse and destroy them for moments.
And the deeper we investigate the ruins of history, the more one terrifying possibility begins to emerge.
Every declining civilization eventually discovers the same dangerous illusion, that comfort can replace resilience. What once made societies strong was sacrifice, discipline, and collective purpose. And this is where powerful societies begin changing psychologically, because abundance slowly weakens the instincts that once protected them from collapse. Modern civilizations did not simply become wealthier, they became dependent on systems designed to eliminate discomfort entirely.
Throughout history, societies have always searched for distractions powerful enough to suppress collective anxiety.
But beneath the surface of convenience and entertainment, modern societies were becoming psychologically exhausted.
And as civilizations optimized themselves for comfort, they quietly surrendered the very struggles that once gave human societies meaning. The greatest weakness of declining societies is not poverty or war. It is the gradual loss of emotional resilience beneath endless comfort. And history reveals a terrifying pattern. The societies most consumed by comfort are often the prepared to survive.
The most dangerous phase of collapse begins when people can see the warning signs, but psychologically refuse to believe them. The teeping cemetery. Throughout history, civilizations rarely collapsed because they lacked warnings. They collapsed because modern societies developed a new survival mechanism during decline. Distraction, powerful enough to suppress collective fear. And this is where denial becomes institutionalized, because systems built on confidence cannot survive widespread panic.
The final stages of societal confidence often appear strangely normal from the outside, because civilizations perform stints.
What terrified historians most was not how different collapsing civilizations were from one another, but how disturbingly
civilizations can survive hardship for long periods of time, but they become truly fragile once people lose confidence in the systems around them.
And when societies become dependent on optimism itself, truth gradually becomes treated as a threat to stability.
Because the true collapse of a civilization begins long before its buildings fall. It begins the moment.
At its peak, Rome looked eternal, a civilization so powerful that most citizens believed nothing on earth could ever destroy it.
But beneath the glory of the empire, Rome was already beginning to weaken from within.
As the empire grew more unstable, entertainment became one of the most effective tools for maintaining social control.
Rome's greatest threat was not the enemy outside its borders, but the growing disconnect between the empire's rulers and the realities facing ordinary people. And as economic pressure intensified, the empire slowly began consuming the very people it depended on to survive. Rome became trapped by the very scale of its own success, an empire so large that maintaining stability eventually became impossible. When institutions lose legitimacy, civilizations enter a dangerous stage where power itself becomes unstable. Long before Rome officially fell, its systems had already begun quietly failing across everyday life. By the time the outside world delivered the final blow, Rome had already spent generations destroying itself from within. And this is why the story of Rome still matters today. Because every civilization that believes it cannot collapse, every civilization eventually discovers a dangerous temptation: the ability to borrow stability from the future. Debt began as a tool for temporary survival, but over time it evolved into the invisible architecture controlling entire societies. Modern civilizations stopped building prosperity through accumulated wealth and began financing daily life through permanent dependency. And this is where debt became dangerous, because economies were no longer growing naturally, they were being artificially sustained through endless financial expansion. By the time societies realize their systems are drowning in debt, the entire civilization has already become dependent on keeping the illusion alive.
Debt allowed societies to simulate prosperity long after genuine economic strength had already begun fading away. And slowly, entire populations began inheriting obligations larger than the futures they were promised.
Entering Klismarakilits. History repeatedly warned humanity that civilizations built on unsustainable financial systems eventually reach a breaking point. Because the moment a society depends on infinite debt to preserve stability, collapse stops being a possibility and becomes only a matter of time.
What begins as public service slowly evolves into a system focused on preserving power itself.
And this is where institutions become dangerous, because systems designed for efficiency eventually lose the ability to adapt to reality. As institutions accumulate more power, they often become increasingly isolated from the consequences of their own decisions.
Civilizations under pressure do not usually reduce control. They expand surveillance in order to preserve institutional stability.
The deeper institutions sink into self-preservation, the more ordinary people are forced to absorb the pressure of societal decline.
History reveals the same terrifying pattern again and again. Institutions often recognize collapse long before. When trust in institutions begins collapsing, societies enter a psychological stage where people no longer believe the system exists to protect them.
And eventually, institutions become trapped inside their own machinery, too large to reform.
Because in the end, civilizations rarely collapse when institutions become weak. They collapse when institutions become incapable of serving anything except themselves. Every civilization depends on a shared understanding of reality, and the moment that reality begins fragmenting, the foundations of society start weakening from within.
Throughout history, power has always belonged to those capable of controlling the narrative people believe about the world around them.
But modern civilizations entered a new phase of instability when information stopped being designed to inform society and began competing for attention instead.
And this is where societies become vulnerable, because populations overwhelmed by information eventually lose the ability to recognize truth itself.
For the first time in history, civilizations created systems capable of altering collective perception.
Modern civilizations became so connected that psychological instability itself could spread across continents within hours.
Because once a civilization loses its shared reality,
every empire eventually becomes addicted to expansion. Because once growth slows, the illusion of stability begins to crack.
What once required armies and conquest eventually transformed into something far more invisible: the endless expansion of economic systems consuming the world itself.
Modern societies stopped measuring success through sustainability and began measuring survival through permanent consumption. The terrifying reality was that modern economies no longer knew how to function without continuous expansion. As societies expanded outward physically, many were quietly collapsing inward psychologically.
Expansion created unprecedented wealth, but it also created civilizations so interconnected that disruption in one region could destabilize the entire system.
History's repeatedly revealed the same pattern. Empires rarely collapse because they stop expanding.
Because once a civilization becomes addicted to growth, even slowing down begins to feel like collapse.
As societies become more unstable, entertainment evolves from leisure into a mechanism for maintaining social order.
Rome understood something modern civilizations would later perfect. Distracted populations are easier to govern than anxious ones. And this is where civilizations begin psychological retreating from reality, replacing participation with passive observation. Modern societies industrialize distraction itself, transforming human attention into one of the most valuable resources on Earth. The more unstable a civilization becomes, the more desperately it increases the scale of distraction.
Entertainment no longer existed simply to entertain. It became emotional anesthesia for populations struggling to psychologically endure modern life.
When civilizations become overwhelmed by complexity, they often retreat into spectacles simple enough to emotionally process.
The terrifying power of distraction is not that it hides collapse completely, but that it delays public recognition until...
Because civilizations rarely collapse while people are fully paying attention. They collapse while entire populations are looking somewhere else. What once required armies and informants now operates through machines capable of tracking entire populations automatically.
The more unstable societies become, the more institutions justify expanding control in the name of maintaining order. Surveillance no longer simply observed society. It gradually began shaping human behavior itself.
Because the final stage of societal control is not when people realize they are being watched, but when
modern civilization became more connected than any society in human history, yet millions of people began feeling more alone than ever before. Technology gave civilizations unprecedented communication, but it also transformed loneliness into a global industrial system. For many people, modern convenience slowly replaced the communities that once gave civilization emotional stability. Hyper societies integrated technology into daily life. The more emotionally disconnected many people quietly became from reality itself. Modern civilizations optimized human productivity with incredible precision, but often neglected these helpless. Human civilization evolved through tribes, families, and shared physical communities. Yet modern life, the most advanced societies in history, quietly produced populations struggling to emotionally endure the very systems designed to improve their lives. Every civilization eventually faces the same dangerous imbalance, when wealth begins concentrating faster than society can emotionally tolerate. History repeatedly revealed that civilizations grow most fragile when prosperity becomes increasingly disconnected from the people sustaining the system itself. Modern economies continued generating extraordinary wealth, but increasingly fewer people were able to feel its benefits in their daily lives. And this is where civilizations begin hollowing themselves out from within, because systems designed to generate wealth stopped distributing stability across society. The economic machine no longer existed primarily to support civilization. Civilization itself increasingly existed to sustain the machine.
The middle class once stabilized entire civilizations, but many societies, as wealth concentrated upward, social trust began collapsing downward across entire populations.
History showed that societies can survive inequality for long periods of time, but eventually populations begin questioning whether the system still serves them at all.
Every civilization convinced itself that rising inequality was temporary, until the system became too imbalanced to repair peacefully.
Because the moment a civilization concentrates too much wealth into too few hands, it begins weakening the very social foundation required to keep the entire system standing. Every civilization builds infrastructure believing it will outlast generations, but eventually those systems age, and this is where modern societies become terrifyingly fragile, because entire civilizations now depend on systems most people barely understand. The terrifying reality of advanced civilizations is that the more efficient systems become, the less resilient they often are during disruption. Modern civilization connected everything together for maximum speed and efficiency, but interconnected systems also spread collapse faster than ever before. One of the clearest warning signs of societal exhaustion is when populations begin accepting visible system failure as ordinary life.
History repeatedly demonstrated that infrastructure does not collapse because societies stop needing it. By the time infrastructure visibly collapses, civilizations have usually already spent years weakening the systems required to prevent it.
Because civilizations are ultimately held together not by ambition or technology, but by fragile physical systems that must function every single day without failure.
As civilizations became too fragile to survive natural economic cycles, they began creating artificial
Every declining civilization eventually discovers the same dangerous strategy, creating temporary stability by expanding money faster than underlying reality. And this is where modern economies became psychologically dependent on intervention powerful enough to suppress the consequences of instability.
Artificial stability works by borrowing confidence from the future, but eventually civilizations run out of time they can safely borrow from.
Modern civilization built an economic system so interconnected and artificial that confidence itself became more valuable than physical wealth. For many societies, prosperity no longer came from productive growth. It came from increasingly sophisticated methods of postponing visible collapse.
The deeper civilizations depended on artificial stability. The more catastrophic, even small disruptions became for the entire system.
History repeatedly demonstrated that artificial stability can delay collapse for years, but it often magnifies the consequences once reality finally returns.
Because once societies become dependent on artificial stability, maintaining the illusion itself becomes more important than confronting the underlying problems destroying the system. And eventually, civilizations reach a terrifying stage where they can no longer distinguish between ills. Modern civilization achieved unprecedented prosperity by connecting the world together, but interconnected systems also create what once linked civilizations through trade, eventually fused entire economies into a single fragile global machine. This is where globalization revealed its hidden danger. Societies optimized for efficiency often lose the resilience required to survive disruption. Entire nations became dependent on resources, technologies, and supply chains controlled thousands of miles beyond their own borders. The more connected the world became, the easier localized disruption could spread into worldwide instability. Modern civilization trained entire populations to expect uninterrupted convenience, but global systems were never designed to absorb permanent instability. As global tensions increased, supply chains transformed from economic systems into strategic vulnerabilities capable of destabilizing entire nations. History repeatedly warned that civilizations dependent on complex external systems eventually become vulnerable to disruptions beyond their control.
The terrifying realization was not simply
because once a civilization builds its survival on global interdependence, even small fractures can threaten the stability of the entire world system. What once required armies, borders, and conquest could now be achieved through platforms capable of influencing billions of minds simultaneously. Modern societies voluntarily transferred enormous amounts of power into systems they barely understood, because convenience felt more immediate than long-term control.
And this is where the balance of power quietly shifted, because the corporations controlling digital infrastructure became.
For the first time in history, civilizations allowed private systems to shape not only economies and communication, but the psychological development of entire generations. The deeper civilizations integrated technology into everyday life, the more difficult it became to separate human society from the systems now governing it.
Technology companies no longer simply operated inside civilization. Many had effectively become civilizations of their own.
History always rewarded those who controlled the systems societies depended upon most, and in the digital age, those systems became almost entirely technological. The terrifying reality was that modern civilization increasingly relied on systems controlled not by elected governments, but by technological, driven by their own survival and empire. Because once civilizations surrender enough power to technological systems, the line between serving humanity and governing humanity slowly begins to disappear.
Beneath the surface of modern civilization, a quiet psychological exhaustion was spreading through entire societies.
Human beings evolved to survive hardship together, but modern societies increasingly demanded emotional endurance in isolation. And this is where modern life became psychologically dangerous, because civilizations optimized human productivity faster than human minds could adapt. The more societies attempted to engineer efficiency, the more many individuals felt emotionally disconnected from their own lives. Entire generations were raised inside systems designed to maximize engagement without fully understanding the long-term psychological consequences. The fear beneath modern society was not only economic or political. It was the growing realization that history revealed that civilizations often begin collapsing psychologically long before collapse becomes visible physically. Because the final fragility of every civilization may not be found in its economy, military, or infrastructure.
History left behind countless warnings, but civilizations repeatedly convinced themselves that collapse only happened to others.
What terrified historians most was not how civilizations collapsed, but how similar the warning signs often became before the fall. And this is where history becomes deeply uncomfortable, because most collapsing societies received warnings long before their systems finally broke apart. History repeatedly demonstrated that civilizations rarely collapse because of a single crisis. They collapse when multiple forms of pressure converge faster than systems can adapt. Many civilizations believed technology or power would exempt them from natural limits, but history repeatedly proved otherwise. Another warning repeated throughout history was the collapse of shared trust, because societies cannot survive indefinitely once people stop believing in each other and their institutions. The deeper experts studied collapse patterns, the more disturbing the similarities between past civilizations and the modern world began to feel.
History does not repeat itself, but civilizations repeatedly recreate the same conditions capable of destroying them from within. Because the greatest historical warning humanity continues ignoring may be this.
For years, civilizations often appear stable, until suddenly the pressure hidden beneath the surface reaches a critical point. The most dangerous phase of collapse is not constant chaos. It is the long period of apparent stability before acceleration suddenly begins. And this is where civilizations become trapped, because systems dependent on confidence often suppress warning signs until the danger becomes impossible to contain. Most people expect collapse to look dramatic from the beginning, but tipping points often emerge through subtle instability accumulating invisibly over time. Once collective trust begins breaking faster than institutions can restore it, societies can destabilize with shocking speed.
Modern civilizations became so interconnected that disruption in one system could trigger instability everywhere else almost instantly.
History repeatedly showed that collapse rarely unfolded gradually forever. Eventually, civilizations reach a moment where pressure transforms into acceleration. By the final stages, collapse no longer behaves like isolated crisis management. It behaves like a chain reaction civilization struggles to interrupt.
Because civilizations often seem strongest immediately before the tipping point arrives. And once acceleration begins, every civilization reaches a moment when confidence itself begins to fracture. And once belief...
Collapse often becomes irreversible not when systems physically fail first, but when populations stop emotionally believing the future will improve.
The day confidence breaks is often marked by one terrifying contradiction. Official optimism grows louder precisely as reality becomes harder to control.
History repeatedly demonstrated that civilizations can survive enormous hardship until populations stop believing hardship is temporary. The collapse of confidence, unlike economic recession or political instability, it fundamentally changes how people...
The terrifying reality is that once confidence breaks across enough of society, collapse begins accelerating through human psychology itself. Because the final stage of every fragile civilization begins the moment enough people stop believing the system will protect them tomorrow. Slow collapse does not always look like chaos in the beginning. Sometimes it looks like ordinary life becoming gradually more difficult every year.
People living through slow collapse often because accepting life is abnormal.
And this is where civilizations begin deteriorating quietly. When institutions continue functioning just enough.
Slow collapse changes populations psychologically, because people gradually stop expecting stability and begin organizing life around uncertainty instead.
Many civilizations collapse slowly enough that younger generations no longer recognize what genuine stability once felt like.
The terrifying aspect of slow collapse is that societies often adapt to worsening conditions instead of reversing them.
As collapse becomes normalized, many people stop trying to repair the system and focus instead on psychologically surviving inside it. History showed that civilizations can remain functional long after their foundations begin breaking apart, which often makes slow collapse difficult to recognize in real time.
Life inside slow collapse is not always dramatic. It is often defined by exhaustion.
Because the final danger of slow collapse is not simply that systems weaken over time, it is that entire paralysis. As modern systems became too complex for human beings to fully control, civilizations increasingly delegated, and this is where the future became psychologically dangerous, because entire societies were built around human labor systems increasingly becoming obsolete. Modern civilization pursued efficiency with such intensity that humanity slowly began adapting itself around the needs of technological systems. The terrifying reality was that modern economies became increasingly systems.
The faster civilization accelerated technologically, the more difficult it became for political and ethical systems to evolve at the same pace.
History repeatedly proved that civilizations often create systems more powerful than they are emotionally prepared to manage responsibly. Because the final question facing civilization may no longer be whether technology can save humanity, but throughout history, civilizations often became most obsessed with appearances precisely when their foundations were becoming weakest. And this is where societies become psychologically trapped, because admitting the system is failing would force millions of people. The more fragile systems become, the more aggressively civilizations often attempt to simulate confidence.
Most civilizations do not collapse because everyone suddenly panics. They collapse because populations normalize instability for too long.
The illusion of stability becomes essential to maintaining civilization once systems grow too fragile to withstand widespread psychological fear.
And this is why the final stages of societal decline often feel strangely surreal. Because normality continued itself, history repeatedly demonstrated that civilizations can sustain illusions far longer than they can sustain the systems supporting them. The terrifying power of the final illusion is that it allows societies to continue functioning, even while collapse quietly accelerates underneath them. Because the final illusion every collapsing civilization believes is this: that the system will somehow continue. History revealed that civilizations never disappear completely.
something always rises from the ruins left behind. When empires fall, power does not vanish. It reorganizes into new structures shaped by the failures of the previous age.
And this is where humanity often rediscovers something the civilizations lost during periods of extreme complexity.
Every collapse creates a vacuum, and human beings inevitably rush to fill it with new systems promising stability, meaning, and protection.
Future civilizations may inherit advanced technology without inheriting the centralized systems that once controlled it globally. After every major collapse, societies rarely read the exact same world.
The survivors of collapsing civilizations often become obsessed with one question: whether humanity will repeat the same mistakes again.
What comes after empire is often shaped by how deeply future generations understand the dangers hidden inside the previous civilization's success.
History suggests that collapse does not end civilization. It resets the conditions under which civilization must survive.
Because after every empire collapses, humanity faces the same silent question: whether the next civilization will finally learn how to survive.
When people stop agreeing on what is true, civilizations begin losing the invisible cohesion required to remain stable.
The collapse of shared reality does not happen suddenly. It spreads slowly, until
Were fallen civilizations simply victims of circumstance?
And this is where the modern world becomes deeply unsettling. Because humanity may now possess enough, and this is where expansion becomes irreversible. Because civilizations built on endless growth eventually begin consuming the foundations required for their own survival. And eventually, expansion stopped serving humanity. Humanity itself became fuel for the expanding machine. History repeatedly demonstrated that societies approaching decline often become obsessed with entertainment precisely because reality itself becomes too psychologically painful to confront directly.
The future risk facing humanity may not come from one enemy, ideology, or catastrophe. Modern surveillance became most powerful not because people were forced to accept it, but because convenience made it feel normal.
Yet history also revealed something extraordinary. Human beings continue rebuilding even after civilizations fail. And this is where surveillance evolved beyond security, becoming one of the most valuable forms of power civilization had ever created. The question may no longer be whether civilization can survive forever, but whether humanity can learn to build systems that do not eventually consume themselves. History revealed a disturbing pattern. Civilizations under pressure rarely reduce control. They expand it until freedom itself begins feeling dangerous.
Every empire believed it was different from the civilizations that came before it, until history quietly proved otherwise. The terrifying power of modern surveillance was not its ability to record the present, but its growing ability to predict the future behavior of entire populations.
And perhaps the silent question facing humanity is not whether civilizations collapse, but whether the loneliness epidemic did not emerge because people stopped communicating. It emerged because society replaced meaningful connection with constant digital interaction.